You probably won't believe me, but honestly, I don't care. I'm not here to convince you. I just need to tell you what happened before someone else ends up like we did. If you're thinking about going where we went, just don't. You won't come back the same if you come back at all. It all started back in 2019. Me, Ryan, and Jeff were in our last year of college, and we had this tradition of exploring abandoned places. It wasn't anything official, just something we'd do after a few beers, looking for that rush, you know? None of us believed in the paranormal. Ghost stories were for campfires, right? But we loved the thrill, the idea of sneaking into a forgotten building, snapping a few cool photos for Instagram, and laughing about it the next day. One Friday night, we were hanging out at Ryan's place, tossing back a few beers. That's when Ryan suggested something different. Hey, how about that old grain mill in Dorchester? People say it's haunted or whatever. Might make for some cool shots. Jeff was all in immediately. I hesitated for a second, but shrugged it off. We'd done stuff like this a dozen times before. What could go wrong? The mill was about an hour outside town, way out in the middle of nowhere. The drive felt longer than usual, passing through these tiny towns that looked frozen in time. By the time we got there, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. It wasn't late, but the sky was the deep, dark blue that comes just before night fully sets in. The mill loomed at the end of this dirt road, huge and broken down, with weeds growing out of every crack. It felt off even then. Ryan pulled out his flashlight and camera. Jeff was his usual self, cracking jokes and acting like this was just another adventure. I stayed quiet. The entrance was half collapsed, and the floor creaked under our weight as we stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. The first thing that hit me was how big the place was. Massive, rusted machines lined the walls, and graffiti covered everything. It should have felt like just another old building, but it didn't. We wandered deeper, our footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Ryan was ahead of us, scanning the room with his camera, when we heard it. A laugh, not from one of us, but a light, playful giggle. It was distant, but unmistakable. Jeff froze, his smile gone. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaking a bit. I nodded, my heart pounding. There was no one else here, right? Ryan, always the brave one, decided to follow the sound. We walked deeper into the mill, through a maze of rusted machinery and decaying walls. That's when we saw her, a doll, just sitting there in the corner, propped up against the wall. She was old, dressed in this dirty wool dress, with cracks in her porcelain face. Ryan, being the idiot he was, picked it up, chuckling. But the second he touched it, his smile dropped. Behind the doll, scratched into the wall, were deep gouges like someone had been clawing at the concrete. That's when the temperature dropped. I know it sounds kitsch, but it's true. 1 second it was fine, and the next it was freezing. We all felt it. I could see Ryan's breath, and he was wearing a jacket. "We should leave," I muttered. Jeff nodded, and even Ryan, who never backed down from anything, looked shaken. We turned to leave, but when we got back to the entrance, the door was shut. And not just shut, it looked like it had never been opened. The boards were nailed in, as if they'd been that way for years. "That's not possible," Jeff whispered, his voice barely audible. Panic set in fast. We tried another door, but the same thing. It was like the building had sealed itself. Then, without warning, Ryan vanished. 1 second, he was right behind me, and the next, he was gone. We called his name, over and over, but all we heard was the echo of our own voices. I glanced at Jeff, and his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. That's when we saw it. A figure just standing at the end of the hall. It wasn't human, not really. Too tall, its arms too long, its head slightly tilted like it was watching us. Jeff screamed, and before I could react, something yanked him into the darkness. His scream cut off instantly, leaving me alone. I ran, not even thinking, just running. I don't remember much after I started running. My mind was racing, body moving on instinct. The hallway seemed longer than it had been before, like it stretched out, twisting, pulling me deeper into the mill. Every corner I turned, every door I passed, it was like the building was shifting. The walls felt too close, almost suffocating. My chest tightened as I pushed forward, my breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. I kept thinking, don't stop, just keep going. But no matter how fast I ran, it felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. That figure, whatever it was, I swear it was watching me. Not chasing, not following, just watching, waiting for me to break. That's when I heard Ryan's voice, faint, like a whisper in the wind. "Help me," he said. But it wasn't right. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was all around me, echoing off the walls, bouncing back into my head. I knew I couldn't trust it, but hearing his voice made me hesitate. I slowed down for a second. What if he's alive? What if he needs me? My brain fought against every instinct I had. I knew something was wrong. Everything screamed at me to leave, to run, but I couldn't just abandon him. He was my friend. I called out, "Ryan, where are you?" My voice sounded small, hollow in the massive space. No answer. I kept walking, slowly now, feeling my way along the walls. The floor creaked with every step. My heart pounded so loud it felt like it would drown out any sound. That's when I saw a door, just slightly ajar, with light spilling out from underneath. It didn't make sense. The place had been dark since we arrived. But there it was, this faint, warm light. My hand hesitated on the door handle. Everything in me screamed to turn around, but I pushed it open. Inside was this small, empty room. Just 4 walls and a single chair in the middle, facing the corner. And in that chair, Ryan. But he wasn't moving. His back was to me, slumped forward like he was asleep. I called his name again, but he didn't answer. I took a step closer, then another. "Ryan," my voice cracked. Still nothing. I reached out to tap his shoulder, and that's when his head snapped up. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead. But they were wrong. Empty, lifeless. His mouth moved, whispering something I couldn't make out. My pulse raced, and I stumbled back. "Ryan," I yelled again, but it wasn't him. It couldn't be. His skin was pale, almost gray, like he hadn't breathed in hours. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I was frozen in place. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever or whatever it was right behind me now, and I could feel its presence, towering over me. My mind screamed to run, but my body refused to move. Suddenly, the chair creaked as Ryan's body slumped forward again. The room went cold. I snapped out of it, spinning around, but the doorway was empty. I bolted. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible, through the maze of hallways, until I finally found an opening, a broken window. I didn't care about the glass, didn't care about anything but getting out. I crashed through, hitting the ground hard outside, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until I couldn't see the mill anymore. When I finally stopped, I looked back, expecting to see that figure standing in the distance, but there was nothing. Just the old, decaying building sitting there like it had been for years. Jeff and Ryan never made it out. When the cops came, they didn't find any bodies. They searched the place top to bottom, But it was empty. No trace of them. No sign we'd even been inside. The only thing they found was that old doll, sitting by the front entrance, just waiting. I've told this story a few times since then, but no one ever really believes me. They think it's just a prank, a trick of the mind. But I know what I saw. I didn't go back to the mill after that night. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. But there's something about these kinds of places, they stay with you. Not just in memories, but in your bones. Every time I close my eyes, I see that chair, the way Ryan was slumped over, his eyes empty. It wasn't just a trick of the light. There was something wrong in that room, something that followed me out of there. Weeks passed, but it didn't feel like life returned to normal. People at work noticed I wasn't myself. "You all right?" They'd ask, but how do you explain something like that? How do you tell someone that you feel like you've left part of yourself behind in an abandoned mill? That no matter where you go, a shadow seems to hang over you, creeping closer when you're alone. I kept it to myself, hoping it would fade. But it didn't. One night, I was sitting in my apartment, trying to unwind with a movie, when I heard it faint at first, but unmistakable. That same knocking sound from the mill. It wasn't loud, more like a distant tapping, but it was enough to send a chill through me. I muted the TV, holding my breath, waiting to hear it again. There it was. A slow, deliberate knock. I told myself it was just the neighbors, maybe the building settling, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I got up and walked to the window, peering through the blinds. The street outside was empty. No movement, no wind. But the knocking continued. It felt like it was coming from inside the walls. My heart raced as I checked every corner of the apartment, convinced I'd find something lurking, waiting. But there was nothing. I tried to shake it off, went back to the couch, but the unease stuck with me, like a weight pressing down. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every little sound, set me on edge. And then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. "Help me," a voice so faint, I could have convinced myself I imagined it. But it wasn't in my head. It was real. Ryan's voice, just like that night in the mill. I sat up, drenched in sweat, scanning the room for any sign that I wasn't alone. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone and texted a friend. I didn't even know what to say. "You ever feel like you're being watched?" Seemed ridiculous, but I needed someone to acknowledge it. No reply. I sat there, staring at the screen, waiting for some kind of answer, but nothing came. I tried to tell myself it was stress, maybe guilt over what happened to Jeff and Ryan, but the voice, the knocking, it wasn't just in my head. It followed me like a shadow I couldn't shake. The next day, I went to the library. I didn't know what I was looking for, just something to make sense of all this. I spent hours digging through old articles about the mill, but most of it was the usual: a tragic accident here, a fire there. Nothing that could explain what I'd seen. Then I found it, buried deep in a newspaper archive from decades ago. A story about a group of workers who went missing during construction, never found, presumed dead. Some said the mill was cursed, but it was just superstition. Or so they thought. I couldn't stop reading. The more I learned, the clearer it became. The mill wasn't just abandoned, it was forgotten on purpose. Too many strange things happened there, things people couldn't explain. Accidents, disappearances. The town just stopped talking about it, like it never existed. But the stories were there, hidden in old records, waiting for someone like me to dig them up. That night, as I lay in bed, the knocking came again. Louder this time, more urgent. And then the voice. "Help me," it whispered. I shut my eyes tight, trying to block it out, but it wouldn't stop. It was inside my head now, crawling through my thoughts. And no matter how much I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan was still out there, somewhere, waiting for me to come back. I thought maybe if I ignored it long enough, the knocking, the voice, would just stop. Like it was all some trick my mind was playing on me. But that's the thing about this kind of stuff, it doesn't care if you believe in it or not. It sticks. The next few nights, I started sleeping with the lights on. Stupid, I know, as if a little light could keep away whatever was messing with me. But it wasn't just fear. It was the sense of being watched, like something was waiting for the right moment to show itself. One night, I was sitting on my couch, trying to lose myself in some mindless TV, when I felt my phone buzz on the table. It was Jeff. I hadn't heard from him since everything went down at the mill. His message was short. "You still hearing things?" I stared at the screen, debating if I should respond. I didn't want to admit that I was. That would make it real. But it was real. I texted him back, just one word, "Yes." Seconds later, the phone rang. Jeff sounded different, like the weight of what happened had changed him too. "Man, you're not crazy," he said. "I've been hearing things too. I thought it was just me, but I swear. I hear knocking in my dreams. I see Ryan's face every time I close my eyes." His voice shook, and for the first time since all this started, I felt like I wasn't alone in it. Whatever this was, it was messing with both of us. I didn't want to talk about it anymore, though. Talking made it worse, like inviting the thing closer. But Jeff kept going. "I went back to the mill," he said, almost whispering. My stomach tightened. I hadn't even considered going back. "There's something in there," he continued. "I don't know what, but it's not just the past haunting us. It's alive." That night, after I hung up with Jeff, the knocking returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It felt like someone was at my door, but when I got up to check, there was nothing. Just the empty hallway. My heart raced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that going back to the mill was the only way to end this. But I wasn't ready, not yet. Days passed. Each night, the sounds got worse. Not just knocking now, but footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps that stopped just outside my bedroom door. I'd lie there, frozen, listening, waiting for whatever was out there to come inside. It never did, but the waiting was almost worse. I couldn't keep living like this. I had to do something. I reached out to Jeff again. "We need to go back," I told him. "Whatever's in that place, it won't leave us alone until we face it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, the hesitation clear, but finally, he agreed. We made a plan. One last trip to the mill. The night we were supposed to go, I couldn't focus on anything. My hands were shaking the whole day, like my body knew what was coming, even if my mind tried to block it out. I packed a flashlight, a crowbar just in case. When Jeff picked me up, he didn't say much. Neither of us did. We were both too scared to admit it, but we knew this wasn't going to end well. As we pulled up to the mill, the wind seemed to die. The air felt different, thicker somehow. We stood there for a moment, staring at the dark outline of the building. It felt like the walls were watching us. "Let's get this over with," Jeff muttered, leading the way. Inside, the place felt even more oppressive than before. The shadows seemed darker, and every creak of the floor echoed louder than it should. We made our way to the room where Ryan died, our footsteps slow, hesitant. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When we reached the doorway, Jeff froze. He pointed inside, and there it was. That chair. Empty this time, but something about it felt off, like we weren't alone. We stood there, staring at the empty chair, like it had some kind of pull on us. Jeff didn't move, didn't speak. Neither did I. It wasn't fear that kept us frozen, it was something else, something that felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that the room itself had been waiting for us to come back. And now that we were here, it had us right where it wanted. I took a step forward, slow, deliberate. The floor creaked, a sound that felt louder than it should have. My flashlight beam trembled over the walls, catching on the cracked paint and old machinery. The air was heavy, but it wasn't the kind of weight you feel in your chest. It was in my head, like a dull pressure pushing against my thoughts, making it hard to focus. Jeff finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. We shouldn't be here. He wasn't wrong. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave. But we'd come this far, and leaving now would only make it worse. Whatever was here wasn't going to let us just walk away. I forced myself to look at the chair again. It was just a chair. Old wooden, like any you'd find in an abandoned place like this. But it was more than that. It was a reminder, a marker of what had happened. Ryan had been sitting there when I stopped myself. There was no use thinking about it. We both knew what we'd seen. Let's check the back room, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Jeff didn't argue. We moved as one, our steps careful, our eyes scanning the shadows that seemed to cling to the corners. The door to the back room was half open, creaking slightly as the wind from outside pushed against it. I reached for the handle, hesitating for just a second, then pushed it open all the way. The room was small, barely more than a storage space. Shelves lined the walls, old tools and rusted equipment scattered everywhere. But something caught my eye on the far wall. There were scratches. Deep, jagged lines carved into the plaster, like someone had tried to claw their way out. Do you see that? I asked, my voice tight. Jeff nodded, but he didn't say anything. We both knew what those marks meant. Someone had been in here, trapped, desperate. The thought made my skin crawl. This wasn't just about the past. Something was still here, something that hadn't left when Ryan died. I stepped closer to the wall, running my fingers over the grooves. They were fresh, not decades old like the rest of the building. Someone or something had been here recently. This isn't right, Jeff muttered, taking a step back. He was pale, his eyes wide with panic. A sound echoed through the room, sharp and sudden. It was a metallic clink, like a chain dragging across the floor. We both spun around, our flashlights sweeping the room, but there was nothing. Just empty space. But we'd heard it, both of us. Something had moved. Let's get out of here, Jeff said, his voice shaking. He was already halfway to the door, not waiting for me. I should have followed him. Every part of me wanted to. But I couldn't stop staring at the spot where the sound had come from, frozen in place by a gut feeling I couldn't explain. I stood there, my eyes glued to that spot on the floor. Jeff had already bolted out of the room, but I couldn't move. It was as if something was holding me in place, like my body knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. The sound was still fresh in my ears, metal, scraping across concrete. There was no mistaking it. Someone or something had been in this room with us. I took a breath, forcing myself to focus. It's funny how your brain reacts in moments like this. All the training, all the logic, it goes out the window. Instinct takes over. You start hearing things, seeing things that might not be there, but you can't tell the difference anymore. I scanned the room again, my flashlight shaking just a little as I swept it across the walls. Nothing. I should have followed Jeff. It was the smart move, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. There was something off about this place, something that didn't sit right. Maybe it was the scratches on the wall or the fact that Ryan had disappeared here, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. People don't just vanish without a trace, not in real life. A sound snapped me back this time. It wasn't the metal. It was softer, like something brushing against the doorframe. I turned quickly, the flashlight bouncing off the cracked paint and old wood. For a split second, I thought I saw something move, just out of the corner of my eye. But when I focused, there was nothing there. Just the empty doorway. "Jeff," I called out, even though I knew he was long gone. My voice echoed back at me, filling the space with a strange, hollow sound. It was a mistake. In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, pressing against my skin. I could feel it now, whatever was here. It wasn't happy. I backed toward the door, my heartbeat picking up speed. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the doorknob, and I felt a wave of relief. Just get out, I told myself. It's over. But then I heard it again, this time louder, clearer. The metal scraping, coming from the far corner of the room. I swung the flashlight in that direction, but again, nothing. Panic started to creep in. This wasn't normal. I had been in abandoned places before, plenty of them, but this was different. This felt deliberate, like someone was toying with me, playing a game. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breath coming quicker as I turned and bolted for the hallway. I nearly ran into Jeff, who was standing just outside, pale as a sheet. "Did you hear it?" he asked, his voice shaky. I nodded. There was no point in pretending it didn't happen. We both heard it. We both felt it. But what did it mean? That's what we couldn't figure out. We walked out into the night, the cool air hitting my face like a slap. It helped clear my head, but not enough. I glanced back at the building, its dark windows staring back at us, empty and cold. There was something about that place, something we weren't supposed to understand. And maybe that's why Ryan had disappeared. Maybe he got too close to something that didn't want to be found. Jeff broke the silence. "We're not going back in there, right?" I shook my head. I had no intention of stepping foot in that room again. Not tonight, not ever. Whatever was in there could stay there. We had seen enough. But as we walked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen everything. There was still something left, some piece of the puzzle we had missed. The drive back to town was quiet, too quiet. Jeff didn't say much, and neither did I. We were both lost in our thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd just experienced. It felt like the kind of thing you read about, but never think will happen to you. But there we were, sitting in my car, headlights cutting through the dark, and neither of us could explain what we heard. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us, but the road was empty. "Do you think it was real?" Jeff finally asked, breaking the silence. I didn't answer right away. I didn't know how. Sure, we both heard the scraping, saw the room, felt the weight of something watching us. But was it real? I've always been a logical guy, grounded in facts. But facts didn't fit what we just went through. "I don't know, man," I muttered. It was the only honest answer I could give. The thing about experiences like this is they make you question everything. You want to believe there's a rational explanation, but deep down, you know there isn't. Not this time. As we pulled into town, the familiar lights and streets should have been comforting. Instead, they felt wrong, like we didn't belong here anymore. That building had changed something in us. I could see it in Jeff's face too. He kept fidgeting, looking out the window like he was expecting something to jump out at him. Maybe I was doing the same thing. We parked in front of the diner, and for a second, I thought about suggesting we go inside, grab some coffee, and try to talk it out. But the truth was, I didn't want to talk about it. Not yet. Not until I'd wrapped my head around what had happened. So I just turned to Jeff and said, "Let's get out of here." He nodded, not saying a word, and we drove off again. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that room, heard the metal scraping, felt the coldness of the air pressing down on me. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that it was all in my head. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us home. A few days later, I got a call from Ryan's sister. She asked if I'd heard anything about him, if there was any news. I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That we went looking for him and found something we couldn't explain. That the last place he was seen was full of weird noises and unexplainable feelings. It didn't feel right to dump all that on her. So I told her what I could. No, nothing yet. But we're still looking. After that call, I couldn't get Ryan out of my head. I kept thinking about what might have happened to him. Where did he go? Why did no one find him? And then, more than once, I wondered if he had been in that room, if somehow we'd gotten close to the truth without realizing it. The thought stuck with me, gnawing at the back of my mind, but I didn't share it with anyone. Jeff stopped talking about it completely. Whenever I brought it up, he'd change the subject or act like he didn't know what I was talking about. I think it scared him more than he was willing to admit, and I didn't blame him. It scared me too. A few nights after the call from Ryan's sister, I started noticing small things. At first, I brushed them off. A chair slightly out of place, a light flickering for no reason. You tell yourself it's just your mind playing tricks because you're still on edge from everything that happened. I didn't want to think too hard about it, but deep down, it was starting to get to me. I couldn't ignore it forever. One evening, I came home late, threw my keys on the counter, and headed for the fridge. As I turned around, I froze. The keys were on the floor, right by the door. I didn't remember dropping them, but I chalked it up to being tired. I picked them up, feeling that uncomfortable twinge in the back of my mind. It was the kind of thing that would usually slip past unnoticed, but now it stuck with me. Then the knocking started. It wasn't loud, just soft taps on the walls. At first, I thought it was the pipes, maybe something settling in the house. But it was too deliberate, too timed, like someone was waiting for me to notice. I'd stand in the hallway listening, and the knocks would stop. The moment I sat down, they'd start up again, just enough to keep me restless. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and walked around the house, searching for the source of the sound. Each room I entered was as empty as the last. I could feel the tension creeping up on me, but I refused to let it control me. I had to find something, some explanation. But there was nothing, just the sound following me from one room to the next. I sat back down on the couch, frustrated, staring at the blank TV screen. That's when I heard the scraping sound again, like something dragging across the floor upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. The memory of that room came flooding back. The same sound, just quieter now, like whatever it was had followed me home. I didn't move. I just sat there listening, waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. I tried calling Jeff the next day. He didn't pick up. We hadn't talked since that night, and part of me wondered if he was going through the same thing, but I wasn't ready to hear his answer. What would I even say? Hey, remember that weird sound we heard? Well, it's in my house now. It sounded ridiculous, even in my own head. So, I hung up before leaving a message. Days passed, and I kept hearing it. Every night, the scraping grew louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was just stress or my imagination. But there's only so much denial a person can take. One night, I grabbed a flashlight and decided to go up to the attic, where the noise seemed to be coming from. I had to know. I couldn't keep living with this, whatever it was. I climbed the stairs, my grip on the flashlight tight, every step heavier than the last. The scraping continued steady, like it was waiting for me. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the handle, and for a split second, I considered turning back, but something in me pushed forward. I twisted the knob and opened the door slowly. The attic was dark, colder than I expected, but empty. At least, it looked empty. I scanned the room with the flashlight, my pulse racing. That's when I saw it. A small pile of dust and debris in the corner, like something had been moved, something heavy. The same corner where the noise seemed to be coming from. I took a step closer, the floor creaking beneath me. That's when the scraping stopped. I stood there, staring at that pile of debris. It didn't look like much, just some dust and small bits of wood, but something about it felt off. It wasn't random, like the attic had settled over time. It was fresh, like something or someone had disturbed it recently. I crouched down, sweeping my flashlight over the floor, trying to make sense of it. The sound that had been following me stopped completely, and for a second, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe I'd finally caught it. But then, as I was about to stand up, I noticed a faint mark in the dust. A trail. It led toward the back of the attic, disappearing behind a pile of old boxes that I hadn't touched in years. My chest tightened, and I felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. I didn't want to move those boxes. Every instinct I had was telling me to walk away, to leave it all alone. But something in me needed to know. So I started shifting them aside, one by one, the wooden floor creaking under the weight. Each box felt heavier than the last, my pulse quickening with every move. When I finally cleared the space, there it was, a small door, barely noticeable, tucked away in the corner. I stared at it, not believing what I was seeing. How had I never noticed this before? I'd lived in this house for years, gone through this attic countless times. But that door was new to me, as if it had just appeared. My hand hovered over the knob, my mind racing. This was the moment. Whatever had been messing with me, it had led me here. I took a breath and turned the handle. It opened with a low groan, revealing a narrow, dark passage. The air inside was colder, like it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. I shone the flashlight inside, but the beam didn't reach far. Just a few feet ahead, the walls seemed to close in, and the path disappeared into blackness. I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong, like stepping through that door would take me somewhere I didn't want to go. But I couldn't stop now. I'd come this far, and backing out wasn't an option. I squeezed through the doorway, the walls brushing against my shoulders as I moved forward. The space was tight, claustrophobic. Each step echoed, the sound bouncing off the narrow walls, making it feel like something was right behind me, following every move. I tried not to think about it, just focused on the light ahead. Suddenly, the passage opened up into a small room. It was almost empty, except for a few scattered objects on the floor, a broken mirror, an old faded photograph, and a single wooden chair. The air felt thick, not in the sense of being hard to breathe, but like the room held onto something old. I could feel it. I stepped closer to the chair, drawn to it for some reason I couldn't explain. As I did, a chill ran through me. There was a figure in the photograph on the floor, but the face was scratched out. I knelt down, picking it up, and that's when I noticed the initials carved into the back of the chair. They weren't mine, but they felt familiar, as if I'd seen them before. Maybe it was just the darkness playing tricks, or maybe it was something more. I heard it again, the scraping sound, this time louder, more deliberate. It wasn't coming from behind me anymore. It was right there, in the room with me. My pulse quickened, and I spun around, shining the light in every direction. There was nothing. Just the empty room, the chair, the photo. But the sound continued, echoing in my ears, growing closer, until it felt like it was right next to me. I backed away slowly, keeping the flashlight in front of me, trying to calm my breathing. Whatever was happening, it wasn't finished with me yet. I could feel it. I felt trapped in the small room. My flashlight's light wavered, generating shadows that danced around the walls, giving the place a sense of life. It seemed oppressive, and the air thickened around me. I took a step back, attempting to shake the feeling of being watched, but the pressure just increased. Each noise increased louder, and the floor creaked beneath my weight, as if it was struggling to hold me. The chair stood there, peering at me like an old acquaintance with a secret plan. My heartbeat was ringing in my ears, drowning out everything else. What was it about the chair? The initials engraved into the wood appeared to pulsate with life of their own. It felt as if I was connected to something ancient, hidden deep in the past of this location. Perhaps the previous owners left behind more than just their possessions. As I turned to face the entrance, chills ran through my body. The sound had stopped again. A terrifying realization hit me. I wasn't alone in this place. I swallowed hard and took a hesitant step toward the door, but it didn't budge. Panic seized me. I pushed against it with all my strength, but it remained solidly closed, as if someone on the other side was holding it shut. I was trapped, and whatever lurked in the shadows was not about to let me go. A loud crash resonated from the far side of the room, making me jump. I spun around, my heart racing. The broken mirror shattered even further, its jagged bits reflecting distorted images of me, twisted and wrong. It felt like a warning, a sign that I was supposed to see something. I forced myself to approach the mirror, feeling the cold glass against my fingertips. As I moved in closer, I noticed movement behind me, a flash of dark hair and a shadow moving away. "Who's there?" My voice quivered, breaking the suffocating silence. There was no response, only the faint sound of something brushing by. My skin prickled with anxiety, and I turned, hoping to catch a sight of whatever was tormenting me. But there was nothing but traces of what once been. My breath quickened as I felt the room press in on me, the walls leaning closer. The air thickened again, and I heard a faint but distinct whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." The words enveloped me like a frigid shroud, making my skin crawl. I wanted to scream and run, but my feet were stuck to the floor. I returned my gaze to the chair, sensing an unexplainable connection. What happened here? What exactly were they attempting to tell me? I closed my eyes and tried to concentrate myself. I reflected on the history of the house and the people who had lived here. My mind raced over stories I'd heard from neighbors about loss and tragedy, all of which seemed to come together in this exact area. It was more than simply a house. It was a collection of memories, some pleasant, others tragic, all contained within these walls. The chair creaked unexpectedly, and I turned just in time to see it rocking back and forth as if someone unseen had just stood up. My heart sank. "No, no, no," I said softly, pulling away. The shards of the glass revealed a face that I recognized but couldn't place. When I glanced closer, the vision faded away, leaving only blackness. Panic gripped me. I tried the door again, this time with full force, and it eventually gave way, swinging open. I rushed out into the tight tunnel, my breath coming in frantic gasps. But as I turned to flee, I caught a glimpse of the same face staring at me through the darkness. It was my own reflection, twisted and hideous, and it laughed silently as it faded into the shadows. The fear persisted, thick and choking. I fell back into the attic, realizing I had only scratched the surface of something much deeper. The room seemed teeming with secrets, and as I looked back at the small door, a sense of fear washed over me. Whatever I had awoken was not yet finished with me.